Good evening, everyone, and thank you for your time tonight to join us in this webinar. I hope you're all keeping safe and well during these extraordinary times and staying COVID safe. This is our first webinar in these times of COVID, so hopefully technology is working for us tonight. So firstly, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Scott Morosky, Managing Director of the Self-Managed Super Fund team. And also to my right, I've got Tim Bate, who's also a self-managed super fund specialist.
Good evening, everyone.
So hopefully tonight we can share some thoughts on building a property portfolio through a self-managed super fund. And at the end of the day, you may have some questions for us that we can help you with. So we won't try and keep you too long tonight. I know everyone's giving up their time to sit and watch us. So we'll see if we've got time at the end of the day to go through questions, but if not, we can certainly email us those and we will answer them in due course. So we'll get started, I think. So our presentation tonight, as I said, we won't try and keep you too long, but I'm assuming, or we're going to make the assumption that most people know what a self-managed super fund is. So we won't get into too much technical detail about that, but we'll talk about why some people have self-managed super funds. And then obviously the main reasons why we're here tonight is to talk about investing in property, and Tim will cover that. And then quickly touch on limited recourse borrowing arrangements and how we can use borrowings. And then also at the end, if you have questions or want to consider a self-managed super fund and property, how to get in touch. So the important slide before we start going too far, for everyone that is listening, just be aware that we're not taking any of your personal circumstances on board, and this is just general advice. And if you do want some advice specifically about your needs, you do need to come and speak to somebody, a self-managed super fund specialist like Tim and myself, to get that information. So this is just general information tonight, and you should always seek additional advice before acting on any advice. So please keep that in mind. So benefits of a self-managed super fund, I suppose the main reason people do choose to have a self-managed super fund and invest their superannuation benefits is ultimately for investment control and the flexibility that comes with that. People in a self-managed super fund are also the trustees, so they ultimately get to choose when and how that superannuation money is invested. So if they have a speciality in property or in shares or some other sort of investment, they can use those specialities to direct that superannuation investments to a particular way. As an example, if you're in a retail or industry fund and you come across a good property or a share that has some good capital growth or future income, you can't go to a retail or industry fund and ask the trustees to put your money there. You're paying them to invest that money for you. So in a self-managed super fund, you have that control to when and how to invest that money. So just like all superannuation funds, it is an effective tax environment. The most you'll pay on any earnings is 15%. Capital gains for investments held for more than a year will only be taxed at 10%, and even better still, in pension phase, when a person can retire, those earnings or those capital gains are completely tax-free, which is always nice. We can use self-managed super funds as an estate planning tool, and it can be important for people when they're creating wealth, how to pass it on to the next generation. Cost control is another important one, where industry and a retail fund will charge on a percentage of the value of the superannuation investments. Self-managed super funds are more, their costs are more determined on the amount of investments or the transactions. And I often use the example of a retired couple who has $2 million in their self-managed super fund, invested in term deposit, which may not be great in this current environment with low interest rates, but if they do, that will be a much lower admin cost than, say, a smaller self-managed super fund, say with 200,000, but they have a share portfolio of 50 different shares. So we're buying and selling, collecting the dividends, the corporate actions that go with it will certainly be more expensive than a self-managed super fund with a $2 million term deposit. So generally, as a rule of thumb, as a self-managed super fund continues to grow, the benefits of the costs start to grow. So it's also, as people have larger superannuation benefits, self-managed super funds may be the way to go. And as Tim will talk on later, we can use our self-managed super funds as part of our business planning, especially when it comes to business property. So they're all sort of the common reasons why people will have a self-managed super fund. So I'll pass over to Tim to talk about why we're here investing in property via a self-managed super fund.
Thanks, Scott. So, of course, you can invest in many types of property in your self-managed super fund. A popular option is residential, but you can also, as Scott alluded to, invest in commercial property, and you can also invest in vacant land. It's a bit of a misconception that you do have to generate a return from your property, but you can invest in vacant land purely for capital growth. But turning to residential property first, this is a very popular option for a number of our clients. It's I suppose it's a toe in the water, and it's an easy sort of starting point for investing in property. I myself have a residential property, a 2-bedroom unit in my self-managed super fund, and just as an example, that's returned about, I was working it out today, it's returned about 10% a year over the past 8 years. So it's a kind of a solid investment, not spectacular by any means, but I suppose in volatile times with the share market and low interest rates, that's not too bad a return. So with residential properties, there are a few important rules and restrictions that the regulators and the tax office have put in place that you have to be aware of. One is that you can't acquire your residential property from a related party or from yourself. So unfortunately, you can't transfer your existing investment property into your self-managed super fund, but you can go out and obviously buy it in your self-managed super fund from a third party. And one of the main restrictions, which is usually sort of referred to as the sole purpose test, or part of the sole purpose test, is that you can't stay in that property while your super fund owns it, or you can't rent it. Or, for instance, if you have a holiday house down the coast, there's nothing wrong with having a holiday house in your self-managed super fund, but you can't use that. It has to be leased only to unrelated parties. We have had a couple of instances where clients have had rent coming in during the entire year, and curiously enough, during the Christmas New Year period, it hasn't been rented out. And when the auditors questioned that, the clients had to put their hands up and say, yes, we stayed there. So that's a no-no. That's going to be reported to the ATO as a breach, and you really want to avoid that sort of thing. So, turning to commercial property, the restrictions on commercial property and dealings with related parties are a little bit more, or much less stringent than for residential property. So you can acquire a commercial property from a related party, and you can lease it to a related party. The only thing you have to ensure is that it's on commercial terms, on an arm's length basis. So, and that is a very popular strategy for, for many business owners. They can transfer or acquire business premises in their superannuation fund and lease it back to themselves. So you're effectively paying rent to yourself, and in a way that becomes part of your super saving in the fact that you're paying rent to your own self-managed super fund. Now, I probably should have covered too that your commercial property can be many different types of property. It can be a factory, a shed, an office, or a farm. And being where we are and located in Toowoomba, we've got many rural clients, and farms in self-managed super funds is another popular option. One of the key exceptions for rural properties is that your You can also stay on the farm in the residence that may be there. So that's one of the sort of exceptions to the rule, that you can't stay in a house. So you can stay on the farm and farm that land as long as the farm is less than 2 hectares. So that's again, that's another very popular option. And I think I can hand back over to you now, Scott.
Thanks, Tim. So the question that probably, I suppose, that leads on from that is commercial or residential property, which one's best? And I suppose at the end of the day, it's the $1 million question. Which, yeah, it's just like property versus shares or fixed interest. We always need to weigh up a number of factors before we can determine what's the appropriate investment for ourselves or for our self-managed super fund. And if we've decided that property is what we want in our self-managed super fund, we need to ask ourselves a few questions or do a bit of research as to whether we want to go commercial or residential property. And they're just some of the things that we need to think about. So lease length. Traditionally, commercial properties will have a longer lease term. We've got a business operating out of those commercial property. The business themselves are probably not wanting to move every couple of years, so would like to maintain a longer lease, and which is probably preferable for the landlord as well. In saying that, with vacancy periods, if one business does move out, there is that risk that, or the tenancy risk, that it might take a period of time before we can find a new business to move into our commercial property. Where with a residential property, there's always people looking for houses to live. People are moving in and out of town, so the period of time that the property stays vacant is generally shorter. We also need to consider, when it is vacant, how are we going to pay for those ongoing costs? Who's going to pay for the rates, the insurance, when we don't have any income coming in? With the lease term, especially if we're going through a real estate agent, a general tenancy agreement for residential properties will be fairly common regardless of where we are, whether it's in Toowoomba, New South Wales. They're generally the same sort of terms which most people are familiar with, especially if they've rented a property in the past. Commercial properties, it requires a lot more negotiation between the landlord and the future tenant. Who's going to pay for the expenses? Is there going to be a market valuing, a rental increase? All these sort of things need to come into it, and we may need a solicitor or a lawyer to help us out with those negotiations and really to document what the terms of those of that lease will be for a commercial property. Rental yields. Now, traditionally, because of the increased risk of commercial property, you will generally see a greater return on commercial properties. And as a rule of thumb, I would suggest somewhere between 5 and 12% return is what historically we've seen. Whereas residential properties, we're probably looking at a 3 to 4% return on the income. So certainly, as I said, as a rule of thumb, commercial property generally provides a greater rental yield. Rental increases, as I said before, in the lease term, a lot of for a commercial property, they will have fixed rental increases on an annual basis, whether that's on a CPI adjustment or a 3 or 4% increase. So generally, a lot of them are fixed into that commercial lease agreement, whereas residential properties, they're not as common. And once we sign a general tenancy agreement with our tenant for a residential property, that they are fixed for a number of years. So we don't get to see that future rental increases. With property expenses, for a residential property, most commonly it's the landlord who will pay for those expenses. So the rates, the repairs and maintenance, water rates, insurance, all those sort of costs are paid by the landlord for residential property. Whereas a commercial property, it is up for negotiation, as I said, and commonly the tenant will pay for some of those expenses, if not all of them. Things like land tax may be another one that we need to consider, who's actually going to pay for for those expenses. So the yield may be important as to who is paying for those expenses. Exposure to economic shocks, as we've all seen, especially in the last 6 months with the COVID-19 pandemic. Businesses aren't immune to economic shocks, so we have had a number of number of tenants asking for rent relief, or where still their business just can't continue and they have to shut up shop. So who's paying for the rent, or who's going to look after the expenses in those periods of time when we haven't got the rent coming in? Whereas residential property, as I alluded to before, we've always got some people looking for houses to live in. We always need that people to live in houses. So whilst we may still have periods of time when a house isn't available for, or isn't being tenanted, generally that isn't as long. So as normally commercial property are at greater risks of that economic shocks when the economy does take a downturn. And capital growth, I suppose, which can be a bit of a contentious issue, but historically residential properties have shown over a longer period a greater capital growth than commercial property. Commercial property really relies on the ongoing income, and that's how commercial properties will generally have a tendency to be valued as a rate of return rather than the bricks and mortar value, which residential property will generally be valued at. So they're all things we need to consider when we're looking at commercial or residential property. As I said, there's no right or wrong answer. We need to do our research and work out what sort of issues or what risks we're prepared to take when we choose between commercial or residential property. Are we prepared to take on higher rental yields at the risk of greater vacancy periods, or the risk that we may not have a tenant in the future because of ongoing economic downturns, compared to a residential property where we may have a longer term tenant or the ability to replace tenants, but we will have I suppose a lower yield in the short term. So they're all things we need to consider when looking at commercial property. Traditionally, with a self-managed super fund, we've always needed that nest egg or that pool of money sitting in a self-managed super fund before we can go out and buy the property. So if we were looking at a residential property and we needed $500,000, well, we needed to have $500,000 sitting in a self-managed super fund because before we could buy that property. So we might have mum and dad pooling their superannuation and their employer putting their contributions in, but in times gone past, we needed to build up that nest egg before we could go into the property market and buy that property. So we may have needed to wait a longer period of time before we could get into that property market. But the government introduced a number of years ago now a thing called a limited recourse borrowing arrangement, or an LRBA. And I won't go into the greater details of what that means, but simply we're now allowed to borrow within a self-managed super fund. So we can start to get into that property market sooner, buy at a lower price and allow that property, like we would if we were doing it in our own names, being able to buy it at an earlier time, use somebody else's money to sort of enjoy future capital growth. Obviously, we need that to pay that loan back over time, but we can use future earnings from the super fund or from contributions that our employer or ourselves is putting into that superannuation fund to put that or to repay that loan. So when we're looking at this strategy for our clients, we like to have that loan able to be funded by, or the loan repayments being funded by super fund earnings or our contributions from our employer. At the end of the day, we want it to stand by itself and not impact their own personal cash flow. So as I said, super fund earnings and contributions should be able to repay that loan, and we're not continually having to make extra contributions or take money out of our own personal savings to fund those loan repayments. Obviously, we need to consider tenancy risk when there's not a tenant there. But as I said, at the end of the day, we're trying to create a strategy where where the self-managed super fund property investment can stand by itself, and we're not relying on other sources of income to do that. So with the limited recourse borrowing arrangement, the banks or the lenders will traditionally only lend to about a 60 to a 70% LVR. So we do need to have some funds in there. So we may need a 30 to 40% deposit, but it's a lot less than we need to start with if we were looking at buying, say, a $500,000 property outright. We may only need a $150,000 to $200,000 deposit to get us into that market. So as I said, we can start earlier, and we're seeing clients take on the strategy in their 30s rather than their late 40s and 50s if they were to buy that property outright. So it is allowing people to use their superannuation money a lot earlier than they otherwise would have to start generating a property portfolio that they would otherwise want to. So why would we want a property investment within a self-managed super fund? And some of these things come back to the benefits of having a self-managed super fund, as I spoke about at the start. But again, investment control. With a property, a lot of people like to see that bricks and mortar. They can drive past it on the weekend or on their way to work, and they can see that property is still there. With the share market, we're impacted by economic impacts that we don't have much control of. We're also relying on a board of directors to control that company. So as a shareholder, we're sort of really at the we're really impacted and don't have much control. So a lot of people like to have that property. They can do that negotiating themselves with a future tenant. And because of that, a lot of people consider property to be a lot more stable. We're not seeing every day on the news how the All Ordinaries or how the value of NAB or BHP or whatever the shares, how they went up each day. So the market may fluctuate, but we're not seeing that every day. So a lot more people are comfortable with having that investment property as their stable investment. As I said before, self-managed super funds are a really tax-effective vehicle. The government is saying, look, you put your money away until you retire, and we'll make it a tax-effective vehicle. So, as I said at the start, the earnings, so the rent, will be not taxed at any more than 15%. Whereas if that investment property is in your own name, if the property is positively geared, your earnings on that property are taxed at your marginal tax rate. And if you're on a higher tax rate, then you could be potentially paying 47%. Whereas on in a self-managed super fund, you won't pay any more than 15%. And even better still, if we're retired and we're now drawing a pension, we can, those earnings are tax-free all of a sudden. And even better still, we might buy that property in our 30s or our 40s and accumulate capital growth for 20, 30 years. And once we retire, if we do sell that property, all that capital growth we've accumulated over those years is tax-free. So all that capital gain, we don't have to pay any tax on. And even if we do sell it before retirement, the most we'll pay is, if we've held it for more than a year, is 10%. So if we had a $500,000 property, which we bought and sold it for $1 million, the most we're going to pay is $50,000, which sounds like a lot, but if we're paying capital gains tax at our own marginal tax rates, it could be in the hundreds of thousands. So it certainly is a good place to have high growing investments for the longer term. Generally, our assets are protected for debtors or from creditors in the event of bankruptcy. So all other if we do become bankrupt or we do get sued, especially if we're in a professional environment, those assets in our self-managed super fund are protected in most circumstances. And as I said before, we're not looking at impacting our own personal cash flow to make these investments. We should use our existing superannuation and the earnings and then also the contributions that either our employer or we're putting in the claims a tax deduction to do that. So we're not impacting our personal cash flow to make these investments going forward. So at the end of the day, if what Tim and I have spoken about, and we've quickly brushed on whether a residential property or a commercial property and what are the things we need to consider, but if we decide that property is what we prefer over shares or fixed interest, I'm certainly not advocating that property is the be all and end all, but a lot of people do prefer property, and if that's something you are interested in, well, you need to make a rational decision on what is the best property for you. Take out the emotion of the decision and just consider the facts and the advice to make the best decision. So is the property a good investment? Is it going to provide good long-term yields? Is it going to offer good future capital growth? Not necessarily is it a property that I would want to live in, but does it provide a good yield and good future growth? Will it appreciate in value over the long term? What are the risks that I spoke about before? Are we going to have long periods where we don't have a tenant? What is the ongoing monthly rent that we're going to receive for that property? So we need to do our research, really weigh up the pros and cons of any investment, whether it's shares or whether it's property or whether it's fixed interest or whether it's in the Australian market or overseas. The same questions we need to ask ourselves all the time is ask those things. Is it a good investment? Will it pay a good income? And what is the future capital growth going to look like in the future? So we need to make or consider all those questions before we do make any investment decision, whether that's in a self-managed super fund or in our own names or in another entity. So hopefully that's given you some information about self-managed super funds and building a property portfolio, especially using self-managed super funds. For anybody who is watching tonight or who couldn't make it and is receiving a recording of this presentation, we are offering a free consultation for anyone watching this presentation to come along, speak with either Tim or myself about firstly setting up a self-managed super fund, or if you do have a self-managed super fund, review your current investment strategy and whether that's appropriate and whether we can accommodate property within that. And then looking at the types of property that you may be interested in and looking at how we can fit that within your self-managed super fund. And I suppose we've spoken tonight about direct property, so residential or commercial property, and as Tim said, even vacant land. But at the end of the day, there are even other avenues that we can invest in property, whether that's listed property through a unit trust. There is a whole heap of different strategies that we can do. So, as I said, we've just spoken about direct investment, but there may be other alternatives and how we do that to, I suppose, achieve the best outcome to fund for your retirement, which is ultimately what we're all trying to do. So, if you do interested in looking at having a consultation with Tim or myself, please contact us either via phone or email me, or even jumping onto our website and accessing us that way. Or even still look at our social media channels, so either Facebook or Instagram, Twitter, or even my LinkedIn profile. So yeah, please, I encourage you to, if you are interested, certainly seek that advice. Come talk with us. Use that offer of the 1 hour free consultation to come talk to us. So thank you for joining us tonight. If there are any questions, please email us and we will get back to you in the next day or two. As I said, this is our first little venture into the webinar, so our ability to answer questions is a bit limited at the moment, so I do apologise for that. But if you do have any questions, feel free to take those details down and shoot either myself or Tim. Tim's email address, if you prefer to talk to him, is So tim.bate, B-A-T-E, at McConaughey Stedman. So yeah, please send us an email or call us to either ask us a question or to arrange that free consultation. So again, thank you for your time tonight, and we look forward to speaking with you, or at least talking with you on emails in the foreseeable future. And again, thank you for your time, and stay safe and healthy and COVID-19 safe. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good night.